So I have to ask you, what does Pan-Africanism then mean to you?
For me, it was a surprise to hear André Blouin's story, where she was calling for the United States of Africa together with Kwame Nkrumah, and I was surprised. I also knew about the United States of Latin America with Bolivar. There was a moment in history where Colombia was banding together with Venezuela also to actually make a larger sort of bloc to actually against imperialism. But all of these movements were very threatening to the West. And that was for me surprising, that it was that awakening that was threatening. And that's for me what the United States of Pan-Africanism would stand for.
All right, you guys, let's get into first.
There is a movement promoting our stories, and many of us grew up with a strong craving for images we can relate to. Production teams, writers, creative heads have come together to tell stories, and this podcast is their voice. The themes covered are very relevant to the Black community, and anyone concerned by the social and racial injustices that are in place to stifle this voice. The Pan-African voice is not easily heard, and here we talk about our movies, that film or doc which you heard about but didn't get to see. What was the story? Where can I watch it? It now has a voice. Tune in. We walk you through these stories and interview the filmmakers. Welcome. Karibu sana. Karibu sana.
And starting right on the lens. Ready, and action.
Today on the Pan-African Film Podcast, we get the privilege of speaking to Johan Grimonprez, and he is a Belgian filmmaker who wrote and directed soundtrack to a coup d'etat. It is a feature documentary, and we were also able to meet with Johan here in Washington, D.C., where it was screening at a private screening by the Africa Society. So Johan, welcome to the podcast, and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
So yeah, I'm Belgian, and of course...
Oh, you're Belgian.
Yeah, of course, it digs into the dark history. It's like the dark pages out of the history of my country, which the history of my country is for half of it intertwined with that of the Congo, of course. And so all its privileges, the way Brussels is constructed, in its layout, it's all like built with rubber money that goes back to the Congo. So there's, of course, that complicity. And, for me, it was like digging in the backyard to sort of come to terms with sort of the history of my country. And for that matter, a history that's still wiped under the carpet for a big part. For example, Patrice Lumumba is still called a communist. That story has not fully been told. Acknowledgement of the crime. There was a parliamentary commission not so long ago, 20 years ago, where they admitted that they were in the know, but they didn't admit that they were complicit. And there's recent things being published where that complicity has been proven in details. I've added some of the cables and the telegrams in the film. But still, when the royal couple went to visit Congo, we're talking about a year and a half ago, they were still discussing or doubting, would we say I'm sorry, or would we express just regret? But if you say I'm sorry, it means that you commit two crimes, so that you have to talk about reparation. And that's the big thing. There's no discussion about reparation. Although, for example, it's only a year and a half ago that the tooth of Patrice Lumumba, the gold tooth, the only thing that was a remnant still in Belgium, was repatriated, and Juliana Lumumba, the daughter, accepted it. But these things are still very recent, how my country has not come to terms with that whole history. Not fully.
I see. So you're saying, as a Belgian, until the issue of reparations is addressed, you don't think it's fully coming to terms?
No, it's not. It's too half-baked sort of decisions. And if you know what's going on in the Congo now, the recent sort of eruptions in the East Congo were M23, a private militia group, with the help of Kagame, Rwanda's embedded troops in that M23 private militia, have reconquered Goma, which is the border town leading up to Rwanda. And it's exactly where all the conflict minerals are located. The coltan, the lithium, that is partially the makeup of our green energy, the Tesla, the iPhone. And it's like a week and a half ago, the European Parliament in Brussels is approving and sending weapons to Kagame, the leader of Rwanda, actually sustaining that sort of occupation of East Congo, where friends of mine, Malia Mungo is a Congolese filmmaker. Her uncle died in that eruption, and M23 is directly responsible for rape as a tool of war to empty the villages to get at the conflict minerals. And now they've sort of called out that Goma and Bukavu, and you have to know Bukavu is where Denis Mukwege, whose statistics are mentioned at the end of the film after the iPhone commercial, that he already sort of treated 80,000 plus raped women. That these are the women that actually made it to the hospital, but that hospital is now in the hands of the M23, directly responsible for the rape of these women. So these things are even like not addressed even in Belgium. Or it's a couple of journalists that open it up, but still, you know, the European Parliament is approving this, so of backing it up. So for me, this is all crucial things that should actually be addressed.
Yeah, it was interesting how you kind of put the pieces together, you know, with the backdrop of the beautiful jazz performances and just kind of the storyline that you presented. Was that like a narrative that you kind of scripted beforehand and then you found the various footage to put it together? Or was it vice versa?
I would say it's more or less, if you sort of study history, that history offered itself, where I could not but, through my research, find that music was very much a protagonist. You know, the music is not just a soundtrack, it's a soundtrack to Coup d'etat. So the music is very much a political agent and very much a historical agent. That tracing that history, you know, from in the 50s within the independence of the Congo, and then leading up what's going on with sort of the plotting and the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba, that exactly happened when they sent Louis Armstrong to the Congo. You know, I could not but sort of see all the layering that was happening and reveal it in the film. So I very much made music as a protagonist of this film. But it was not just something I invented. It was more how, you know, really listening to history, that's what it offers itself. And then you cannot follow through. It's like, you know, when a novelist writes his sort of concocts and invents his actors, then he puts the actors in certain sort of situations where that particular actor cannot just but react in a way that you put them to confrontations that a novelist would say, you know, it's at one point the characters that start writing the script and the story. And it was very much for me the same, you know. For example, Patrice Lumumba, when he was in prison and was released, unanimously claimed by all the political Congolese parties in Brussels at the round table. And then he arrived 25th of January. A couple of days later, independence was claimed. And he was accompanied by Joseph Kabasele and African Jazz and Dr. Nico. And on the spot in Brussels in the Plaza Hotel, they were composing Independence Cha-Cha. And so you see that the politics was always accompanied by the music. And that Independence Cha-Cha anthem became very popular all over the continent of Africa, so much so that in Rhodesia, it became the name for the liberation movement, which then became Zimbabwe. In Zambia, of course, Rhodesia was much bigger, but it was a very important sort of anthem that made it all across the continent. Or when Patrice Lumumba is actually still a beer sales agent, he actually goes around from bar to bar in the Cité, and he's hiring Rockamambo, and with the music it becomes very popular, where he actually is calling for independence. Giving beer for free in the Cité was very much a way of adding to his political campaign, where the topic of the day was, of course, shall we get a free country? Shall we get independence? And music accompanied him as well. You know, the bookending of the film, which opens with Max Roach's drum and then ends with Abbie Lincoln's scream, but it's Abbie Lincoln together with the writers, the Women's Writer Coalition, amongst Maya Angelou, the writer, and playwright Rosa Guy, that they organize and calling for all the women to protest the murder of Patrice Lumumba. That's going to be announced that same Friday, mid-February. And they do it in front of the Louis Michaud bookstore on 25th Street and 7th Avenue in New York. But it's the musicians that actually initiate that protest. And together with other musicians like Amir Baraka, Paul Robeson, Max Roach, Abbie Lincoln, they actually crashed the Security Council. And it's the musicians who initiate that protest. Also, for that matter, we insist freedom now, which is very often, very much inspired. For example, Tears for Johannesburg, which is a track of that album, was inspired by the black woman in South Africa, apartheid South Africa, tearing up their passport because they were protesting. And it was the short film massacre that inspired Tears for Johannesburg, which is a track from We Insist Freedom Now. So there's a back and forth between the liberation, the independence movement in Africa, which on its own then inspired the civil rights movement. But jazz was very much part of that. And that scream or that protest in the United Nations Security Council was very much the opening salvo for the Black militant movement. But so the music sort of configures in there very largely. And then, of course, the jazz ambassadors that were sent out to win the hearts and minds of the global South, Dizzy Gillespie or Duke Ellington or Louis Armstrong, and then researching deeper each time I could make a connection to a coup d'etat. So you have the U.S. State Department, which there was the two Dulles brothers. Was Foster Dulles was the U.S. Secretary of State, and then Allen Dulles, his brother, was the head of the CIA. And there were two hands on the same tummy concocting that foreign policy, where one would send in, a black jazz ambassador, and underneath they would plot the coup d'etat. And I could trace it to Dizzy Gillespie in Syria, where Operation Straggle was buying up the Syrian government. That was the CIA. Duke Ellington arrives in 1963 in Iraq, and there's the very night of his first concert. There's a coup d'etat in the palace, 100 meters away from the concert. But that coup is actually a counter coup for a coup that was instigated also by the CIA. And then, of course, which is more featured in the film, is Louis Armstrong arriving in the fall of 1960, while the downfall and the assassination is being plotted on Louis Armstrong of Patrice Lumumba. So music was actually very much a historical age, and I could not but make music into a protagonist in the layering of the film.
So did you find in your research the jazz musicians were aware they were being kind of, used in that way politically?
Well, I think there was for sure, Dizzy would say, of course, we were used politically because we were sent to all the hot zones. Or he would also laugh and say, I didn't go over there to sugarcoat segregation back home. So he knew he was sort of, sent out to defend democracy, but it's very schizophrenic because back at home they were second-rate citizens and not allowed to vote yet. So the civil rights movement is in full swing. And in the meantime, they're sent out to defend democracy, which is ironic and schizophrenic, of course. But yeah, there's the quote in the film as well, where they say, we were the black kamikaze band, sending to all the hot zones, and the frictions where the Cold War was sort of, undefined, meaning Iran, Syria, the Middle East. At one point, Foster Dulles was very much afraid of the pan-Arab situation where Abdel Nasser was banding together with Syria, and they would make a pan-Arab union, which was at the time the United Arab Republic, which, existed for a couple of years, but it was a union between Syria and Egypt. And that freaked out the U.S. State Department. So they sent Dizzy and also Dave Brubeck, for example. Dave Brubeck arrives in 1958, and he's rerouted literally by Foster Dulles to actually go to Syria. But of course, I think that the musicians were in the know. Louis Armstrong at one point as well. But I would not say that Louis Armstrong was in the know that Patrice Lumumba was about to be assassinated. He heard about it when he got back home mid-February 1961. That tour was 1 year long. It was a very long tour. But when he got back home mid-February, he heard about Abraham Lincoln's protest at the United Nations and got really upset. So, he at one point even had dinner with Larry Devon, who was the head of the CIA, but I'm sure he did not know that he was the head of the CIA. And en plus, actually concocting at the very time that he was having dinner at one point at Moshe Chambe's house, which was the marionette president at the Katanga secessionist republic, which was succeeding from Patrice Lumumba's unified Congo. And Louis Armstrong was sent to this country, a country that was not ratified. He stayed with Moshe Chambe, the leader, and was having dinner with Larry Devon, the head of the CIA, having dinner with the U.S. Ambassador Timberlake, who actually refused Patrice Lumumba to have a visa to the United Nations, the 15th General Assembly, and then also the Belgian advisors. And Louis Armstrong is sitting there and still, Trummy Trombone is explaining how they were siding with Lumumba and that they were grilling Moshe Chambe, telling, Louis Armstrong was telling him, you're in bed with big money, you better take care. But he was not in the know that actually in front of him was sitting Eli Devlin, the head of the CIA. He was undercover as an agriculture advisor. So I'm sure he would not know that he was actually already concocting the murder of Patrice Lumumba at the same time. But of course, they knew about the volatile situation in the civil war in the Congo, because Lumumba and Mobutu's troops were both sort of putting down arms for 2 days when Louis Armstrong arrived. So it's very schizophrenic on several levels.
How long have you been researching? Sounds like maybe a lifetime, but I dare ask.
No, for me, the film was a learning curve as well. I started on the research 2017 somewhere. And so, it was specifically for this film, writing the script, the story, collecting stuff. But it was a learning curve. There's a lot of stuff that I did not know, that I didn't learn in school, especially when it comes to the Congo, because as a kid, you hit over the head with images of the Congo, but they're all deformed or misinformed, and you don't really get to the bottom of what was going on. And so for me, it was also a surprise to learn that actually the monarchy was involved, that literally there was an assassination where the CIA was a part of, and that it was much deeper than I actually ever imagined. And so it was a learning curve as well. So 5, 6, 7 years. The editing took 4 years, but the writing and the construction of the film and the story happens very much in the editing. Was here you don't work with sort of a pre-written script. It's the archives that also redirect the way you're going to concoct and construct the story, of course. Like this, for example, William Burden, the audio that we found at the Columbia University Diplomatic Studies, we found the audio of William Burden, and this was the president of the Museum of Modern Art, but he also was a CEO of Lockheed, advisor to the Pentagon, who was appointed U.S. ambassador to Brussels. But he was also a secret CIA spy, and he had sort of mining interests in the Katanga. He had stakes in the Katanga mining industry. But here we found cables that he was sending to Alan Dulles, and he literally spills the beans in this audio where he said, I was siding with the Belgians in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And I fell from my chair when I read this, and so we sort of reorganized the edit of the film to make that really as a crucial element in the unfolding of the plot of the film.
Yeah, I can imagine that it was very much a case that as the plot unfolded, the story took shape. That's how I imagined it. I also wanted to touch on the aesthetic of it. It's very much, well, to me at least, it appeared like very influenced by the 70s. Kind of blaxploitation looking graphics and fonts. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, these are actually, it's the Blue Note labels, that was a jazz label, the Blue Note jazz label, which started already, in the 60s. They had black and white pictures, but they made it sort of very colorful, where they had sort of one tone over an album, and then they would have a contrasting typeface that would sort of go in contradiction with that. And we inspired ourselves on the Blue Note. We even have a couple of Blue Note albums in the film, like Art Blakey one. And then we have John Coltrane, which are literally called the Blue Note labels. But then we actually imitated that style and use it for the musicians. But then we thought, why not use it also for the politicians? So while I feel that the music is very much a protagonist, even a political protagonist, we treated the politicians also as, in a sense, in its design, also we pulled it through how the musicians get their label, the politicians will get the same label. But we would even put it further in the editing, where we would use political speeches or UN votes as sort of lyrics for the jazz compositions. And that's the way we were conceiving the editing. If, say, the music sort of steps on the political stage, we would treat the politicians as lead singers to the jazz composition. So there was a back and forth in the editing. And that fit very well in the layering, in essence.
Yes, that part worked very well. I felt there was just holding the intensity throughout, even though it seems, how do you make a documentary last that long? It's essentially a political documentary, right?
Or it's all of the above. It's also music.
Like a whole 2-hour music video as well.
Also, So I wouldn't exclude, I like this sort of crossing over of genres where it's sort of a thriller, but at the same time, it's a music video. It's what Hitchcock would do, like, for example, North by Northwest is a thriller, but it's disguised as a comedy. And this is a typical James Bond genre, avant la lettre. It's Hitchcock who set for that genre by mixing genres, like mixing comedy with thriller. And here it's very similar. We would sort of clash genres, but it would still have that thriller element. And of course, it starts off funny and sort of very entertaining, but then it gets more and more serious. And so the thriller element takes over. And it's similar to The Birds, for example, of Hitchcock. It starts off as a comedy, but it ends as a thriller and becomes more and more like a horror movie instead of a comedy, like a romantic comedy. The Birds starts off like sort of, in essence, about a couple. Norben Oost as well. It's like the love interest is prevented to get together because of the political backdrop. But I like where you have this clash of genres that it's not either one or the other. It's political, but it's also entertaining. So it's political, but it's also music. And I feel that's so much more effective because in reality, very often life is very contradictory and there's all these juxtapositions. Even when you can sometimes be sad and at the same time, like at a funeral, you can be so sad and still laugh and have fun because you're together with people. And still the severity of life is seeping underneath, but all these contradictions exist in life as well. And so for me, it was not like one against the other, was sort of, stacking things. For example, a big one is for me, the whole 15th General Assembly, which of course we zoom in on that sort of thriller story of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. But it's set against the backdrop where Nikita Khrushchev is inviting all world leaders to come to the United Nations 15th General Assembly. And all these non-aligned leaders are there. You have Jawaharlal Nehru, Abdel Nasser, Fidel Castro's first speech. You have Sukarno, you have Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou. But the big absentee is actually Patrice Lumumba. He was refused a visa. And then this 15th General Assembly was so important because 16 African countries, including the Congo, are admitted to the United Nations. But it causes a huge political earthquake where, for the first time, the global South, the Afro-Asian bloc, gains the majority. And that's very threatening for both East and West. And so this is the context of that whole story, where Patrice Lumumba becomes the ground zero of how the West is about to deal with this global South awakening and this independence movement. For me, it's not a post-colonial move. It's a neo-colonial grab by the West, how they're going to deal with the resources and refusing the global South and their awakening. But at the same time, this is what's happening in the 15th General Assembly. And it causes an earthquake where, it was called the Year of Africa. And it really changed the outlook. And then Nikita Khrushchev is proposing the decolonization resolution while the United States is sending arm twisters to buy up the votes of African countries, for example. So all these backdrops are layering in the way where music is part of it, but also the global story is very much a part of it. And it's not that it was so much part of that time. You have the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba and then Desiré Mobutu grabbing power 14th of September. 1 week later, the United Nations General Assembly top starts, and very much the Congo crisis is the center dialogue and discussion in the 15th General Assembly. So all of that for me made sense to make that juxtaposition and the layering in a way to have a deeper story and make connections through the layering. Well, the music is part of that as well because it's also Abe Lincoln crashing the United Nations. So it leads up to opening up the United Nations as a backdrop for what's the ground zero is, that assassination. But then the whole scream at the end of the film was sort of a conclusion, which still happens in the United Nations. And so for me, it was obvious to sort of make that sort of grander structure to the 15th General Assembly, which is the backbone of the film as well.
Yeah, and those were, I think, were the real aha moments for me, like even as I claim myself to be a Pan-Africanist and bit of a historian, but those connections you made between, how it all came together, even after, he was murdered, was really interesting. And what drew you into that story and kind of, it made me wonder what was like the chicken and egg there.
there was also some stories that were never told. For example, the story of André Blouin. I found reference to her as a prostitute or, the most outspoken woman. The intelligence called her the most dangerous woman of the continent of Africa, but she was a Pan-African rebel and very outspoken. And so they put her on a death list. But her story was written out of history because she was a woman and very outspoken. And I couldn't find anything else. I had to research and look for her memoir. I got in touch with the daughter, Yves Blouin, who became very much an advisor to the film. And then I have to say, history has a way to find redemption, because the book, the memoirs, were just 1 month ago republished, 1 year after the film came out. The memoirs have been republished by Verso, by the daughter, Yves Blouin. And Yves Blouin sent us an envelope roll of film. And then we found images of André Blouin, who was the advisor and chief of protocol and speechwriter for Patrice Lumumba. And we found images of her in Leopoldville, Kinshasa, at the time, when she was working for Patrice Lumumba. And that for me was so crucial to also include that in the film. And her story has never been told before. It's as if she's written back into history. And it's such an interesting sort of story in the way she was also advocating with Kwame Nkrumah. She was a mixed-race kid, so she was kidnapped. They were not allowed to be with their parents, so she was put in an orphanage in Brazzaville. And when she was 16, she ran away. Made it to Guinea, became the advisor to, or worked with Sékou Touré, the first leader of Guinea. And then through Sékou Touré got to know Kwame Nkrumah, the first independent leader of Ghana. But he very much was arguing for the United States of Africa. And so in 1958, he was already creating a union with Sékou Touré and Guinea, where that was the beginning of the African Union for the United States of Africa. And so when it comes to sort of the women movement in Africa, André Blouin, through Kwame Nkrumah, was also arguing for the United States of Africa. And then Patrice Lumumba was because she was invited by Kwame Nkrumah, who was sort of the advisor to Patrice Lumumba, a bit his mentor. And Leopoldville would become the capital of the United States of Africa. But all of that was very threatened for the West. But André Blouin was very important as a key figure in this whole movement as well. Things that I didn't even know, if you talk about the United States of Africa, that there was ever ideas to actually make a United States of Africa and have a union, asking Niger to join. Mali was part of that union in the beginning. Major Keita became part of that. And then the next person joining would be Patrice Lumumba with Congo joining the union, the Pan-African Union in the United States. To me, that was all very also surprised me, and a story that I never was told or learned about. So that for me was crucial.
I see. Something that also really struck me in how you were telling the stories was the use of silences. It's actually something I'm going to be focusing on. We also started a retreat for screenwriters. So we do a retreat that kind of moves around so that the structures, the networking in itself. And the next edition in Kenya, the theme is centered around writing silences. And just couldn't help notice, how you used the silences. I mean, the music was so powerful that when it stopped, it was really making a point. And I think that's when it all suddenly became intense, right?
Right. That was sort of another strategy. The film has just been released in Kenya. I was playing in Nairobi, I think a couple of weeks ago, where it was released as well, the film. But the silence is just sometimes taking away the silence suddenly reveals much more than actually too much screaming, right? And that was another device where, for example, with John Coltrane, which it's a concept that we found also Belgian television was partner. But at one point, the music fell away and we saw the pain, the heart-wrenching pain on the face of John Coltrane. And suddenly that seeped through where, as a serendipity, we thought, why not keep it as such? But, I think also history is also so much about what's not written down. History is also about silences, that if you want to rewrite history, it's also about what has not been recorded, all the pain and the trauma that's not been recorded or that's been sort of pushed away. For example, another silence to me, but it's more in the layering of the film, is that we found the We Insist Freedom Now album in its entirety being broadcast on Belgian television. It was, an hour and something concert that was in its entirety broadcast in 1964. But the silence there is also, when that has been broadcast for a Belgian audience, there is a genocide happening at the same time that this scream is being heard on television. And so, again, this is the flip side of something that you would not realize. But it's, again, what is silence? Even with such a loud scream, what is silence that is not talked about? And for me, this is the flip side in the film as well, that you have the scream, but underneath, I wanted to allude to the 1964 genocide of the Belugas in North Katanga, and still up till today is not acknowledged in Belgium. And so you have all these things that are contradictory juxtapositions. Or it's also in sort of the confrontation between the very intimate home movies. For me, that's the heartbeat of history as well, where the clash between the very intimate moments, like, for example, the films or André Blouin's footage that was never out there in the world, but it's also the silence of a woman that was not heard or written out of history. And so you feel the heartbeat of history when it comes to that clash between intimate images, the home movies that we got from Nkole Jean Bofani, the Belgian-Congolese novelist as well, who reads from his novel. And again, he alludes to all the conflict minerals, that all the minerals that were sourced from the Congo that actually never made it back to the population. They always sort of was fueling war. But what's not talked about is that sort of the stealing of all the minerals from the Congo never made it back to actually as resources to enrich the population itself. And so again, this is the silencing. Of course, it's not literally the modus operandi of the film that I'm talking about, but it's also the whole sort of essence of how history is sometimes creamy, but it silences of what else we don't hear about. If you hear about weapons of mass destruction of U.S. administration calling for war to invade Iraq, it's what's not heard about sort of, and still, what's going on in Iraq or Yemen for that matter, or Gaza. It's about the silencing and the things that you don't hear. Mahmoud Khalil, for example, who was leading the protest at Columbia University, he's put in custody. Or, the Oscar winners, the Palestinian film, he's been attacked, one of the Oscar winners, the Palestinian filmmaker. And all these things are silenced. What's going on in Ethiopia or Sudan or East Congo is wiped on the side of all sort of the banal sort of glamorous stories that you hear in the media, but it's silencing what else is in the world of the global south that you don't hear about. And so for me, these are more the silences that you don't hear, but that is embodied by the silence of John Coltrane playing, but you don't hear him. And it's about being silenced. It's also about this whole connotation of being silenced in history.
Yeah, there's definitely that. And obviously a journalistic component. Is that right? Like to the whole story in terms of, revealing some truths that haven't always been in the media, as you say. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's in the fictions where, silence can be very screamy. The silences sometimes are even more heart-wrenching. And it's right at the moment of when we referenced the genocide in 1964, where bombs were being used by the Union Minière, the very ones that are sourcing the minerals. They're also making the dynamite to actually silence the population. But it's much deeper how that silencing is part of history as well.
Yes. So I have to ask you, what does Pan-Africanism then mean to you?
For me, it was a surprise to hear André Blouin's story where she was calling for the United States of Africa together with Kwame Nkrumah. And I was surprised. I also knew about the United States of Latin America with Bolivar. There was a moment in history where Colombia was banding together with Venezuela also to actually make a larger sort of bloc to actually against imperialism. But all of these movements were very threatening to the West. And that was for me surprising, that it was that awakening that was threatening. And that's for me what United States of Pan-Africanism would stand for. Of course, there's much more to it. Like finding that the rumba was actually sourced from Cuba, and I was just in Cuba, but the fourth or fifth generation Congolese that actually in the transatlantic passage made it to Cuba were important for the conga music evolution in Cuba. And then leading up to the cha-cha, then made it back through the Pan-African roots of trade between Havana and Leopoldville that actually made that the rumba came about in Congo. But there's that Pan-African connection as well. But it's also Abbey Lincoln, inspired by Sharpeville and the Tears for Johannesburg that actually inspires the civil rights movement. That's also a Pan-African connection. But sort of see that connection while working through that film.
Okay, so it was like a notion that, I guess how deep it ran was you weren't familiar with until you embarked on this project. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
There was a lot of stuff that I did not know myself. And I could not but include that because, that was so obvious that was there, that she was labeled, André Blouin, as a Pan-Africanist rebel, but hence she was also labeled the most dangerous woman in Africa by the Belgian intelligence. And, by the way, we were trying to source those documents, which I know they exist because there's a chapter in the memoirs of Black Passionarias, the memoirs of André Blouin, that were republished. There's one chapter where she meets Patrice Lumumba for the first time. And he puts on the table documents that were from the Belgian intelligence where they calling for the murder of Patrice Lumumba. But subsequently, a little bit later in those documents, it says, André Blouin should undergo the same fate. And I know those documents existed because Patrice Lumumba got a hold of them. And when we were trying to find them in Belgium and asked the Belgian intelligence, because we're 60 years later, they said, oh, yeah, we found them. You can come pick them up, but it was covered. And then when we asked them, can we come get them? They were all mysteriously sort of disappeared. And so still today, it's not allowed to talk about it in Belgium. It's wiped under the carpet. It's still dangerous to know that there was a death list. I always thought murder is the prerogative of the CIA, but Belgium also had a death list and we're not allowed to talk about it. You see, anno 2025. And it's because she is standing as a Pan-African rebel. They didn't say she's the most dangerous woman of Congo. They said she's the most dangerous woman of the continent of Africa. So there was something to it that had to do with that Pan-African threat. And imagine if there would be United States of Africa, it would be devastating. It would be a devastating blow economically for the West. And it's still the same companies. After the Parliamentary Commission in 2004, Union Minière, so the Union Minière de Haute-Katanga was a company that was a private property by Leopold II, the second king of Belgium. And that sort of changed names because then it was privatized. But then it still exists, but it changed names after the Parliamentary Commission into the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 2004. They changed name into Umicore, and still the same companies that hold the hand over Kagame. They're still involved in the Congo. They're still sucking the country dry. So that hasn't changed. So what I also wanted to, it's mainly encourage Mofani when he takes the trajectory all the way up to today, that actually this film is also the ground zero of what's going on today. And that's why I include the Tesla and the iPhone, that I wanted to allude that that film is not a nostalgic trap, that actually those same things are still going on today.
Those have been recently connected through, I think there's a court case filed by, I think the attorney is British, but it's filed by the government of Congo against some of those U.S. companies. And can you help me make that connection? So obviously the initial imperialists in that region was Belgium, your home country. And so is it just the global geopolitical scenario at the time where there was an allegiance, or the NATO, I guess, pact with the U.S. in terms of how Eisenhower's CIA just got so much more heavily involved?
Well, Eisenhower was very much a Cold Warrior, and he was afraid that NATO would sort of fail against the communist bloc, and that was for him a priority. But he was siding with the NATO countries against the colonial powers. With the colonial powers against the global South. So he would side with France or Britain. And also in the votes, they would abstain. For example, the decolonization vote, they would abstain because Eisenhower would side with the colonial powers against the global South. And the same for Belgium, because at one point Belgium even threatened. There was our Prime Minister, Minister of African Affairs, who then is the Secretary General of NATO, Henry Spaak, who then threatened to actually step out of the NATO with Belgium. And even there was talks about our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wigny, who threatened to get out of the United Nations as well. And we're talking all like in the time span of 1960 when Congo was just about to become independent. And that was very threatening for Eisenhower. And so he was afraid of that NATO would crumble, which was for him more threatening than actually the global South. And then there was a bit of a change because the African Bureau was set up and Nikita Khrushchev, East and West were both scrambling to sort of gain influence within the African continent. And so, of course, there was sort of a back and forth. But Kennedy was maybe more into sort of trying to push, getting closer to the global South.
I think for me, it was also fascinating how you got those interviews with the actual mercenaries, just connecting the dots.
Yeah, those mercenaries were celebrated on mainstream television because they were so-called fighting communism, which was a complete lie. Belgium was labeling Patrice Lumumba as a communist because they would sort of get the United States and the CIA on their side. But that was a complete fabrication. And of course, they were playing East and West. Kwame Nkrumah was playing East and West. Abdel Nasser from Egypt was playing East and West. But, literally, Patrice Lumumba says in the beginning of the film, I'm not a communist. I have to laugh at that. I'm, first of all, an African who stand up for my own rights, for the riches also flowing back to the population. And it's what Malcolm X at the very end of the film says, it's not Marxism or socialism or communism they're afraid of. It's Africanism. It's people standing up for their own rights. And actually, if you would have a United States of Africa, of course it would flow back, the riches would flow back to the population. It's what Kwame Nkrumah says, Africa's not poor. It's the Africans who are poor. And how can that be? It's because the continent is sucked dry. And that was what at stake, it was not sort of communism was an alibi to get at the riches.
I just wanted to bring it back and just kind of hear a little more from you on just the actual documentary, like how expensive was all this research? You said over 7 years, right? How and where are you in kind of the distribution path and journey? Where can our audience watch your film? You said it's in Kenya. Where else is it showing? Those kind of details.
Yeah, 9th of April it was going to be shown at the André Blouin house in Kinshasa. There's Congolese who took the film to Kinshasa and showed it at the André Blouin house. This is Kambale Musavuli, who's running the André Blouin house. But also going to be shown in South Africa because with Vijay Prashad, which is a Tricontinental Institute, is organizing a couple of events in South Africa. But there is a Moroccan distributor for the continent of Africa. So it's going to be shown in several countries in Africa, but also won a big prize at El Gouna Festival in Egypt. And of course, it's distributed worldwide as well. It's just had its release in the United States. It was running in the cinemas, so it's quite surprising that it was running from November all the way up to sort of now March for a documentary of that length to be in the cinema. Usually it's 1 week and then it's taken out of relation. And Belgium has been showing since September. And it's still showing today in mainstream cinemas. And so you have to know that this documentary taken up 2 slots, which people said, we're never going to be able to distribute this film because it's taking up 2 slots in the cinema. So for a documentary, that's really a no-no, but it crossed over to a bigger audience. So I was just in New York like a month ago. We showed it at the Missile Center in Harlem as well, which for me was a bit of a homecoming because that's very close to Hotel Teresa as well. And it was a very lively discussion. Again, we did that already 10 months ago where, Kambale Musavuli, the André Blouin scholar was there, some jazz scholars, but also the sons and daughters of Mac Roach, Akra Shep, the son of Artie Shep was there. It was a very lively discussion, but also like just a couple of weeks ago, they had to turn people away because it was sold out at the Missile Center. And so for me, this is interesting because it's a bit of a homecoming. And when we premiered in Brussels, we premiered at the Vendôme, which is in the Matongi neighborhood, which is the Congolese neighborhood in Brussels. And so it was very much organized by the local Congolese community together with Marie-Dawn Mama, which is the singer who embodied the André Blouin house, the André Blouin voice. and she lives opposite the Van Doon cinema. She actually, her dad was Belgian, but her mother was Congolese, but her dad got killed in East Congo in the 60s, and she had to flee with her mom to Brussels, but she became a big pop icon in Brussels, and she embodied the voice. But when she recorded the voice of André Blouin, she just got back home from the city of Joy, which is in East Congo, the raped woman, where she was actually giving a music workshop. She just got home from there when she recorded the voice of André Blouin. She was part of the debate after the premiere in Matonge, together with Nkole Jean-Bofani as well, the writer, and his family was there. So it was very much a bit of a homecoming as well within Brussels itself for the Congolese community. But yeah, it's been distributed in many, many countries. It's just released in Spain, Australia, Canada just released it. Italy is just being released. So there's many countries. So I never thought that actually would cross over, despite its sort of very experimental, exploratory layering of the film, which actually just made that actually crossed over to a bigger audience because of its experimentation with the music and the layering. So for me, that was a surprise that even went so far to have an Oscar nomination, which for me was quite a surprise. So it sort of plays in all these niches, but it also plays at the same time mainstream. So it does sort of play in all these different venues.
Right. Definitely very artistic. So congratulations. What out of all of these accolades and achievements that it's brought you, like, what is the most gratifying for you? Like, what is the most rewarding?
Well, the Harlem screening a couple of weeks ago, together with, this is Rosa Marie Mili, who's the one who interviewed Fidel Castro and Malcolm X when they met at the Hotel Teresa, who was there, gave a very lively discussion and calling for political action. There was the Friends of the Congo with the Focus Project, who actually very much also an activist sort of project to help the people in what's going on now in Goma. And then Maliga Mungu, who's a Congolese filmmaker, who was also present during the debate. It was a very lively 2-hour discussion after the film. The film is 2 hours and a half, but still we had a 2-hour dialogue and debate in Harlem about all the issues. So for me, that feels really like a homecoming, and I feel like the film really has an echo. Then I thought, wow, this is sort of surprising that actually it does have an echo. And like, for example, now that it's going to be shown at the Africa Society in Washington, where, you know, Viviane is trying to get a lot of the African ambassadors to go watch the film and see the film. For me, that's very gratifying that actually it does also has an echo, not only in Belgium, but also across the African continent.
Yeah, it's great. So congratulations. And then I just wanted to give you some space to share like any websites or links where you want to direct the audience. I don't know if you use social media or anything like that, but.
Well, I have a website. It's my name, johangrimonprez.be, with BE is in Belgium. And you can download, it's a Creative Commons where you can download other films of mine as well. There's one film that is not on there, which is Shadow World, but that's on streaming venues. Shadow World is actually a very similar story, but it digs into it explores and sort of displays how war has been privatized. It's an exploration into the global arms trade together with Andrew Feinstein. Andrew Feinstein published a book called Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. And it blows open how actually, you know, the war defense industry is very much sort of dictating foreign policy where war is privatized, pushing for war to make more profit. He had first-hand accounts when he was the advisor of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, being a member of ANC, Mandela's party, as an MP, as a member of parliament, and advisor to Nelson Mandela, were subsequently to the successors of Nelson Mandela, Jacob Zuma, and also Thabo Mbeki, who, and mainly Jacob Zuma, with the ANC party that were involved with a corrupt deal where they got bribe money, 300 million pounds to actually being pushed to buy a plane from British airspace system, where Tony Blair was involved with this corruption. And that set forth the whole sort of exploration into the global arms trade that led to a bigger arms trade with 1 billion smear money to Prince Bandar bin Sultan of Saudi Arabia, where Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair were involved as well. But this is a previous film called Shadow World. And then there's Double Take, another film of mine, and Dull History, which you can download for free from my website, which is www.johangrimonprez.be.
And another one. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Pan-African Film Podcast. We are now on Spotify and Instagram. Just search Pan-African Film Podcast to follow and like us there. Our new platform is 360 Africa. That's 360 Africa. And we want to thank our Kenyan Vibe partners. Shout out to the KV Squad. Last but not least, we thank our editor Ace. Please send us your feedback, like, follow, and comment.